Hello everyone and welcome back to Game Easy Roll Good. Today we're going to have a quick discussion about exhaustion in both 2014 and 2024 for Dungeons & Dragons for 5th edition. I didn't get the sneak peek of the Dungeon Master's Guide, of course, not surprised about that, not offended, nothing. Maybe I'll get the next one. I did reach out to the other creators' email to see if I could get something in there, maybe for the Monster Manual. I'm not sure what their guidelines or requirements or what they look for are. Maybe I need a bigger audience, something like that. Who knows? Either way, let's talk about exhaustion. But before I get started, real quick, I do want to say if you keep coming back to these videos, please consider hitting that subscribe button if you aren't already. It does help me out quite a lot. But today, like I said, we're going to talk about exhaustion. So exhaustion, quote unquote, bad in 2014. I think a lot of people complained about it for a number of reasons. I never really cared that much. I was impartial to it, more or less. But now I think it's worse in 2024. They had a few iterations of it throughout the playtest. I heard nothing but positive things about it from other content creators, and I legitimately don't know why. I vehemently hated the playtest versions, and I hate the new version as well. But we're just going to have a quick discussion about it, so let's go ahead and get started. Starting off with the 2014 exhaustion table, we can see that 1 level of exhaustion gives you disadvantage on ability checks. 2 levels of exhaustion halves your speed. 3 levels of exhaustion gives you disadvantage on attack rolls and saving throws. 4 levels of exhaustion halves your hit point maximum. 5 levels of exhaustion reduces your speed to 0. And then 6 levels of exhaustion just kills you outright. And all of these effects are cumulative. So if you have 2 levels of exhaustion, your speed is halved, as well as having disadvantage on all ability checks, and so forth. The only ways to remove exhaustion by default within the player's handbook for 2014 was to finish a long rest. This would reduce your exhaustion by 1 level, provided that you had ate enough food and drank enough water during that day. Being raised from the dead will also reduce your exhaustion by 1. The Greater Restoration spell also has the option to reduce a level of exhaustion by 1. And then there's a Potion of Vitality. I believe this was actually introduced in one of the Critical Role supplements. I think the Explorer's Guide to Wildmount. But if you're using that content, this is a very rare potion that just removes all exhaustion from you, period. Going on to things that will give you exhaustion in 2014, there was the Forced March. Traveling continuously for more than 8 hours risks a level of exhaustion. Basically, for each hour beyond 8 hours, the DC would equal 10 plus 1 times the number of hours beyond 8. So, for example, if you were at 9 hours, it'd be 10 plus 1 for 11. If you were at 12 hours, it would be 10 plus 4 for 14. And then if you failed that saving throw, then you would get 1 level of exhaustion per failure. Additionally, there's rules for malnutrition and dehydration. Malnutrition and dehydration are the words that the 2024 Player's Handbook uses. They just had it under food and water here in the 2014 Player's Handbook. So notably here that the exhaustion from these features specifically can't be removed by any of the effects that we mentioned previously until you've had enough to eat or drink. That is the only thing that will prevent you from getting exhaustion from these effects or being able to recover exhaustion from these effects. Notably, if you are one of those species or have a feature that makes it so that you don't require food or water, you can't get exhaustion from these effects. How this works for food specifically, a character can fast. They can go without food for a number of days equal to 3 plus their Constitution modifier before suffering 1 level of exhaustion per day after that. As far as drinking water goes, if you drink half or more, but not the total amount that you need to drink, so like 50 to 99% of the amount of water that you would need in a day, you would need to make a DC 15 Constitution save or suffer 1 level of exhaustion. If you drink less than half of the amount of water that you need per day, you automatically incur 1 level of exhaustion. And then additionally, for water specifically, if you already have levels of exhaustion, then dehydration would cause 2 levels of exhaustion instead. Additionally, in Xanathar's Guide to Everything, they provided a few more things here. So we had the going without a long rest. If you skip a long rest, which is something that you might do because maybe you're in some downtime or something and you want to work on something overnight, you have a DC 10 Constitution save, or you suffer 1 level of exhaustion. And then for each consecutive day after the first, the DC increases by 5. I know some people will just say that if you skip a long rest, you get a level of exhaustion period, which I think is probably more fair than this. DC 10 is kind of nothing. I know you can get a second wind. We've all stayed up 2 or 3 days in a row, and you do feel it that next day no matter what. They also had something here for where if you sleep in armor, not only does it reduce the amount of hit die that you recover after a long rest, but it also says that if you have any levels of exhaustion, the rest doesn't reduce your exhaustion level if you're sleeping in armor during a long rest. Moving on to the 2024 rules. So we can see that in 2024, it's changed pretty significantly. There's no longer this table of different effects at each level of exhaustion. Rather, each time you gain an exhaustion level, you have these static cumulative effects. So the D20 tests affected, when you make a D20 test, and again, that's an attack roll, ability check, or a saving throw, the roll is reduced by 2 times your exhaustion level. So this will be a -2 to all D20 rolls for attack rolls, ability checks, and saving throws at the first exhaustion level. And then it'll be -10 by the time you get to exhaustion level 5. So, it's going to add up pretty quick. Additionally, your speed is reduced. Your speed is reduced by a number of feet equal to 5 times your exhaustion level. So that's, again, 5 at the exhaustion level 1 up to 25 at exhaustion level 5. And then removing exhaustion levels, finishing a long rest removes one of your exhaustion levels. And then when your exhaustion level reaches 0, the condition ends. Notably, all the same ways to remove exhaustion exist in 2024. The condition itself just calls out the long rest, but the rules around resurrection also do state that you do remove a level of exhaustion when you are resurrected, as well as the greater restoration spell still removes a level of exhaustion as well. So all that is still there. If you're playing with the Potion of Vitality, of course, that's still there. But this is how exhaustion works in 2024. It is simpler to understand, I guess, but I'm personally not a fan of it. So let's continue on here. So let's go into the good and the bad of the 2014 rules. So I have the table down here for reference. So I think the cons that I usually see for this one is that the effects are difficult to remember because, exhaustion doesn't come up all that often. So when you have all these different features at different levels of exhaustion, it's hard to remember which one's which. People also say that it has sort of an exponential effect where it starts off pretty light with disadvantage on ability checks, and then speed is had, which is inconvenient. Disadvantage on attack rolls and saving throws is where it starts getting a little dicey, especially with disadvantage on saving throws. And then at the moment you hit 4 and your hit point maximum is halved, then you're like, okay, I'm really in trouble and I need to stop and get this off of me. And then finally at 5, your speed is reduced to 0. And it's like, okay, you really need to stop. And at this point, I don't know how you get more levels of exhaustion unless something is giving you levels of exhaustion or you're not drinking or not eating. But, it does ramp up pretty fast. So that was one complaint that people had. And then there's another one that affects marshals more than casters because casters have spells that require saving throws. And nothing about this table here affects your save DC. So you can fireball, just as well at 1 level of exhaustion as you can at 5 levels of exhaustion. As far as the pros for the 2014 version of exhaustion, again, this is my opinion. I think I like the fact that it starts off very light, that you just have disadvantage on ability checks. You just have a speed halved. Again, 3 is kind of where it starts getting dicey, specifically for saving throws. And because of this, I think players are more likely to intentionally engage with exhaustion. It's sort of a little mini game that they can play on their own. Because again, exhaustion doesn't come up that often, which is, it's kind of a good thing, kind of a bad thing, depending on how you feel about it. But I think, if a player wants to stay up and pull an all-nighter to work on something and just take a level of exhaustion to do that, or risk a level of exhaustion to do that, and have that affect them the next day, I think that's, well within the prerogative to do that. I think that's more an interesting choice that they can make. They're choosing to do something that they think will benefit them while taking the drawbacks for it. So I just think that's good. And that kind of goes into my third point here, that it does have some counterplay. So for example, if you have disadvantage on ability checks, you can choose, maybe to reduce the amount of checks that you can just play like a tired person. It's like, I don't want to do much today. And you are kind of being a drag on the party. That's worth mentioning. But at the same time, disadvantage can be overcome easily by, having an ally take the help action with you, or using things like enhance ability, things like that. Like you're drinking coffee and just be like, I'm just going to power through this. So, disadvantage is easy to overcome. Even at level 3, like a barbarian who is exhausted, they can just use their reckless attack, and then they are at least swinging without disadvantage. It's much harder to overcome disadvantage on saving throws, which again is why I say the 3rd level is where it gets really dicey, because failing your saving throws can be lethal. But yeah, I think overall, I never had a problem with this table. It does get really bad at 4 and 5, and of course, obviously awful at 6. But I do like the way that this kind of has this quote-unquote exponential effect. I think that's a positive thing in my opinion. Moving on to the good and the bad of the 2024 rules, we're going to start with the pros this time. I don't think that there are many, in my opinion. It's easier to remember. You just have a -2 to your D20 tests multiplied by your exhaustion level. So a -2 at level 1, 4 at level 2, 6 at level 3, and so on. And then your speed is reduced by 5 times your exhaustion level. Again, easy to remember. So this is a linear effect. I don't think it's quite as linear as people might think it is, and we'll get into that in a second. But then we're going to go into the cons, in my opinion. I think this immediately feels bad. A -2 is nothing to scoff at. About a 10% greater chance to miss an attack, to fail an ability check, to fail a saving throw. It still affects marshals more than it does casters because nothing about this affects your save DC for your spells. So I think players will be still less likely to engage with it because a -2 feels bad. Disadvantage on ability checks doesn't feel that bad, but -2 to all of my rolls feels terrible. In addition to that, I think there's just less counterplay, whereas disadvantage is easier to overcome. Of course, you have things like Bless, you have things like guidance and things like that can give you these small bonuses to your rolls. But usually you're using those features to get up to a higher DC or a higher AC or whatever you're trying to do. So the fact that you have this -2 is still working against you in a lot of ways. I don't think you're really overcoming anything by trying to use these features. You're just trying to stem the bleeding essentially. And I think more than the 2014 version, this has an accelerated death spiral. And what I mean by death spiral, for those who aren't maybe familiar with the term as it relates to gaming at least, it's basically a mechanic that makes it harder for you to continue to succeed every time that you do it. So if you fail once, then it's easier to keep failing, and then you just keep losing essentially. That's kind of the gaming definition of a death spiral. A -2 to all D20 tests, you have to contextualize that by thinking that's basically the same as a -4 to all ability scores at one level of exhaustion. This, of course, doesn't affect your hit points or your save DC, but for your attack rolls, saving throws, and ability checks, this is effectively the same as taking a -4 to all of your ability scores. And again, like I said, things like Bless and Bardic Inspiration Guidance, they can help mitigate maybe the first maybe 2 levels of exhaustion. A -4 is pretty hard to overcome. But again, the disadvantage from 2014 exhaustion can be worked around with help actions and other features that granted advantage. Even 2 levels of exhaustion in 2024, I think is going to make your character start to feel very unplayable. A -4 to all of your rolls can get you killed more than 2 levels of exhaustion ever could in 2014. So let's look at what I mean by that. So 2024 exhaustion's death spiral starts by the fact that a -2 to any roll is impactful, and none more so than the saving throw. There are many spells in the game, even just low level ones, like a second level spell, like a hold person, where if you fail that saving throw, it puts you in a very bad spot. Not only that, but the majority of ways that you get exhaustion often involve making a saving throw. So the more you fail your saving throws to resist exhaustion, the more you're likely to take more levels of exhaustion, which will cause you to fail more because you keep taking -2, -2, -2, and eventually it's going to be nearly impossible, if not directly impossible, for you to make that saving throw. So like I said here, if you're faced with repeated exhaustion, you're more likely to continue failing in 2024, where that wasn't the case in 2014. You would have a disadvantage on your saving throws at the 3rd level of exhaustion, and that can make it harder to resist further levels of exhaustion if you have to make a saving throw, but it doesn't make it impossible. And so I think a good example, a sort of a case study of this, is that in Rime of the Frost Maiden, if you haven't played that, if you have played that, then you know what I'm going to talk about. But there is a forced march that basically follows the forced march rules that we talked about previously. But you're going through a forced march, and you have to make these continued saving throws each hour to avoid levels of exhaustion. And ideally, you want at least one person to succeed on the challenge. I can't remember what the number of exhaustion levels you could take and still quote unquote succeed. I think this is going to be a situation where I'd be interested to see parties who use the 2024 rules running that module, how many of them actually just outright fail that challenge because of the death spiral of the 2024 rules. You should never underestimate a person's ability to fail a roll, no matter how good their bonuses are. I imagine there are fail safes in the module if all the players fail that challenge. But I think that's, again, just a very good case study of where there was something that worked pretty well with exhaustion as it was in the 2014 rules. But now if you use the 2024 rules, it's actually going to be much harder. And even though the 2014 rules were called, exponential in terms of how quickly it gets worse, I think the 2024 rules are just going to end up with people, possibly just outright dying because they can't make certain saving throws, or they're just missing too many attacks. And so, enemies are able to take more turns than them because they just aren't taking enough damage. I think overall, even though it is a linear scaling, I think the in-game impact of that is going to be much worse. So let's look at the quote-unquote problem with exhaustion. And I think the problem with exhaustion is that it kind of exists in sort of this dichotomy where it either, one, doesn't come up often enough to actually feel like a threat, or two, it comes up too much and then it's extremely punishing. And if you are maybe trying to implement exhaustion in your games, but without thinking too much about it, you can find yourself in these situations where it feels like it's either a drought or a flood. It doesn't feel like players should want to take levels of exhaustion intentionally, but if they know it's not a common threat, they might do it. Again, like if they have downtime and they just want to work overnights to work on a project. But I think this contradiction where it sort of is this sort of drought or flood where you either don't deal with it at all or you deal with it all of a sudden is actually kind of a hint as to what exhaustion is actually designed for. I imagine, more experienced DMs have maybe come to this conclusion already because it's not ever really spelled out in the book. That this is kind of what exhaustion is for, but I think it's pretty clear if you think about it enough. So what is the purpose of exhaustion? We know that exhaustion isn't supposed to be this constant existential threat that players are supposed to think about. By and large, in most adventures, exhaustion isn't something that they're worried about every day. And we can see that the main ways to get exhaustion are either traveling for long periods of time, starving, dehydrating, missing long rests. So what this tells us, in my opinion, is that exhaustion is a pacing mechanic. It is a tool that a DM can use when they want to either cause their players to put on the brakes or step on the gas. It depends on the situation. So, for example, during an exploration or survival, if they're going off, like a big overland travel montage, exhaustion might indicate that they need to stop and rest. If they've been traveling for too long, they've been pushing themselves too hard, they need to take a couple days off and recover from exhaustion. Or maybe they're out of food or water. If you're doing like a heavy survival go stop, go scavenge for food, find a river, get some fresh water, do things like that. And if it's during combat and you have this enemy who's maybe using Sickening Radiance, which is a spell that imposes exhaustion if you fail the saving throw against it, or if a monster has certain abilities, I don't know how many there are. I don't think there's any in the monster manual. I think there might be some in some published adventures. Third-party supplements, I think, probably have some. But if this happens in combat and you're taking levels of exhaustion, that is a sign to step on the gas and maybe pull out some stops that you didn't have that you were saving for later, because that is a very powerful threat that is going to make your life harder when you continue going on. So you want to take out that threat and make sure that you are not taking extra levels of exhaustion. Again, exhaustion is a tool to use. It is not something that they should be running into all the time. And again, that's one of the big things with exhaustion, is that it doesn't come up enough. So we don't ever really interact with these rules that much. I mean, it exists in the player's handbook because it is a condition, and a player should know what it does if they have exhaustion. But I wish there was maybe more guidance in the Dungeon Master's Guide for exhaustion and how to use it in your games, because I think that's kind of the big oversight about this mechanic. There should have been more guidance for the DM. I don't know if there's more guidance for exhaustion in the exploration part of the new Dungeon Master's Guide in 2024. Hopefully there is. I'll take a look at it when I can. Let me know what you think about exhaustion in 2024 or even 2014. If you're a DM and you've been using exhaustion extensively in your games, let me know how you're using that and how that's going in your games. If you made any changes to those rules, let me know which one you like better, if it's the 2014 rules or the 2024 rules. Again, I don't think you can convince me, but I'm just interested in your reasoning. This is a molehill that I'm willing to die on personally. But yeah, let me know down in those comments. And again, while you're going down to those comments, please hit that like button. If you continue watching these videos, especially to the end, and hear me rambling like this, please hit that subscribe button. But we have more videos coming this Wednesday. And again, if you have your notifications turned on right now, I do apologize that you're going to get bombarded with 6 videos every Wednesday for the next 3 weeks. We have the martial subclass changes coming up this Wednesday. And then following that, we're going to have the spellcasting class base class changes. And then the Wednesday after that, we'll have these spellcasting class subclass changes following that. They will have playlists on my channel that you can watch and kind of play them through if you just kind of want to watch them while you're playing a game or doing something else on your phone or on your computer or whatever. But yeah, you have all that to look forward to. So hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you in the next one.